Warhammer box art will always be cool. The box art is what draws a lot of people into the hobby, and if we're being honest, it can really contribute to us thinking something is cool enough to buy. Games Workshop's painting team, better known as the Heavy Metal team, are masters at creating beautiful, perfect, smooth transitions and layering on their models. They achieve this look by glazing the crap out of every single little tiny detail on all of their models. Glazing is an awesome technique, and if it's done well and with care, it really can look amazing. But the problem with glazing is that it takes quite a long time and can be a frustrating, painstaking process that makes you want to rip your hair out. My name is Hiro Song, and today I want to talk about a way to balance painting smooth, box art style models without going completely insane. I recently picked up the Briar and Bone box. The main character, if you will, from the Sylvaneth warband is called the Swarm Sage, and I personally think she is an incredibly cool model, so I'm going to paint her up for today's video. I'm not trying to paint the model exactly like the box art, but more using it as a reference for the smoothness and realism that we're trying to achieve on this model. I primed her with a black brush on primer, and I'm going to start the painting process by painting the hardest to reach area, which in this case is the skin. So I'll start base coating with a light gray so I can achieve that ghostly look that the Sylvaneth often have. As we do this, it's important to start thinking about the focal points of this model. What are the things that people will actually look at, especially when she's on the table, or when it's on display? Where do our eyes go? The likelihood of someone scrutinizing every single tiny detail on this model is, let's be honest, pretty slim. We can use this fact to our advantage and spend the most time on the most scrutinized places of the model. We can also use some of the lesser looked at spots on this model to really emphasize the focal points. I'm going to apply a greenish wash to the skin, and then once that's dry, I'm going to start in with my first time saving technique, dry brushing. Dry brushing, when it's done well, can end up looking really smooth, and it's really quite a bit faster than glazing. I'm going to lightly apply the same gray paint I started with to all of the raised areas on the model with my dry brush. Some things to focus on when dry brushing are to make sure that your brush has a tiny bit of water in it and to only apply very thin layers of color at a time. If you try to apply too much paint all at once, or if you have too much or too little water on your brush, your paint can go on extremely thick or look chalky and a bit dusty. Now that we've done the dry brushing piece, we can go back and highlight the focal points of the model. As human beings, we're naturally conditioned to look at faces. I'm definitely going to focus on this model's face with my highlights. I'll also focus on some of the areas right around the face that we're likely to look at and notice as we look at her face area. I'll also put a little bit of effort into the staff. It's really cool and quite noticeable on the model, so I'd like to put some attention to it. Otherwise, I will give a tiny bit of attention to some of the other most raised and in-your-face areas around the model, but I won't spend a ton of time on everything. I'll start the process by thinning some white paint to a glaze consistency. I keep saying the word glaze, but it's possible that some people won't know what that means. A glaze is basically a super thin coat of paint that takes advantage of the natural transparency of acrylic paint. That means that whatever color is underneath it will show through a little bit if we do a thin enough layer. We achieve this by ensuring that our brush is a little bit moist when we grab paint from the palette. I like to smear the paint around a bit on my wet palette to get some of the moisture off of my brush and make sure that it's nice and loaded with paint. We want it to be loaded enough that we'll get the paint to flow off, but not loaded so much that we can actually see drops of water clinging to the brush. This is a bit of a balancing act that is very dependent on the paint you're using and the brush you've chosen. I personally like to use my wet palette since the paint stays nice and moist on the palette as I use it. On a dry palette, this thin paint smear will dry almost immediately, but on a wet palette, it can stay usable for a while as I continue working. In a few cases here, I make mistakes by applying way too thick of a coat of white to the model. I wanted to make sure to leave this in the video so that I can say that this is totally okay. We can fix it and there's no need to panic. What I'll do is glaze back in a little bit of that gray that I used before to darken the section, and I'll also hit it with a very light dot of my wash that I used before. This smooths the blob of color out, but saves the highlight work that we wanted to do in the first place. The skin is pretty much done here, so we can jump into painting the largest section of the model, the tree bark. I'll start by base coating the model with a rich, deep brown. I'll work pretty quickly here in general, but when I get to the areas that border the skin, I want to be really careful to make sure that I don't make mistakes. We could fix the skin up, but it would be a pain, so being slow and methodical here actually saves us time in the long run. Once we're base coated, I'll use the same process as the skin to layer up this bark with color. So we'll start by dry brushing some lighter brown onto the raised areas. Now we're going to get into what I think is one of the coolest parts of this model. The large branch that the beehives cling to is probably the most noticeable part of this model. I really want to have this part of the model look amazing and draw our eyes. I'm going to do this by using the same type of glazing style layers to create an awesome looking color blend that will go up this large branch. I'll start with the brown color that we used to dry brush this model, thin it down to a glaze-ish consistency and apply it a short way up the branch. We want this to be a thin coat, but it doesn't have to be as absolutely thin as possible. To call this proper glazing, we would want to use the thinnest coats possible. In this case, we want to use a thin coat, but still something that will cover our model decently well, so we don't tear our hair out painting 1,000 of ultra thin coats. 2 or 3 should do us just fine. If in the end of that, a transition isn't looking perfect, we can always go back and apply another thinner glaze over it to make sure that it looks as good as possible. If we take this approach, we get things to look extremely smooth, but only have to do super thin glazes on very small parts of the model. Later, we'll also take advantage of the fact that we can use a wash to greatly improve the smooth appearance of this paint job. I'll make sure to start each coat of each new color a little bit further up the branch to build up the layers of brightness. I'll grab a slightly lighter brown color and start applying it further up the branch using the same process. I'll keep moving up the branch to a light brown, a light green, and finally a darker green on the very tips of the branches. I want to have this branch blend from brown to green to try and tell the story of this model being a living, growing tree that's being piloted by this forest spirit. Having our models tell a story is a great way to make them look and feel alive. A green branch will communicate the idea that this tree is alive and growing as it fights for the woods. At the very end, I'll paint a much darker green onto the leaves of this model to give it some added character, and then hit them with a fast and easy edge highlight of a forest green color. With our blend looking nice, it's time to start glaze highlighting up the rest of the bark. We'll use thin paint again, working up from darker browns to lighter ones, focusing on the more visible areas, similar to our process on the skin. We want to try and be careful here to only highlight the areas that are visible and would get hit directly by the light. If we over-highlight and try to make every part of this model look bright and colorful, we may actually end up taking some attention away from the detail that we've been working really hard to emphasize. Models look a lot better when they have high contrast, so keeping the dark sections dark and the light sections light is much better. Great candidates for very dark sections are the feet, back of the legs, and other places that wouldn't naturally get a lot of light and also won't be looked at a ton on the model. And a bonus here is that it saves us a ton of effort on the model too. Now we're going to cover all of the bark sections in a dark brown wash, which will once again improve the contrast and really smooth things out between our different blends and highlights. Up on the large blended branch, I'm also going to use some green wash, and I'm going to intentionally let it mix a bit with the brown wash, which is still wet as I apply the green. This will add another layer of blending and smoothness to this whole model. This model is already looking awesome, but now's the time for the little details that will finish it off. I'll paint the beehives with a sandy brown, topping it with a light sand edge highlight and a light brown wash. I'll take care of the other details now by painting the bee swarm with the same ghostly green skin that I used before, so a gray base, greenish wash, and a gray dry brush. I also painted the base with some various forest colors, so browns, grays, and greens, and washed it to ensure that they were nice and shaded. I painted some purple on the mushrooms and finished things off by rimming the base in black. And with all that, we're done. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. As always, if you have any questions or thoughts, please let me know with a comment down below. And check out my other painting videos on my channel and keep coming back for more. Once again, I'm Hero Song, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.